Okay, it is day one of the trans rights readathon. I have about 8 books set aside between physical and my Kobo to start with. I think today, to start, I'm going to be reading The Wicked Bargain by Gabe Cole-Novoa because honestly, I'm hoping to be able to talk about it in a future Friday. So I guess by the time this is posted, we'll know if I succeeded in that. I also plan to read, whether today or tomorrow, Detransition Baby by Tori Peters because I have put this off for years. I have a good friend, Katie, who made a joke on Twitter when it came out or when she read it that she hoped her cis friends wouldn't read it because she was afraid of being perceived too much. And for some reason I took that to heart. So she has clarified that it was a joke, but I am also hoping, fingers crossed, knock on wood, that we will be able to get together later this week and talk about Detransition Baby, talk about other books, talk about writing, talk about her podcast. So I guess we will see also if I have succeeded in that. But I have about 8 books, 3 audiobooks, and 2 graphic novels set aside. So I should have plenty to get through, plenty because I am a mood reader. So whatever is striking me in the moment, I should have something to grab. And I am excited to get to a lot of these books that admittedly have been sitting on my TBR for a second in some cases, because as we have talked about before, or maybe haven't, I don't know, I can have trouble going back to backlist titles sometimes if they've been sitting on my TBR too long. So this is the perfect kind of dedicated space to be able to tackle some of those titles. And I'm immensely grateful for the organization of this readathon. I will tag the originator below, but being able to see a bunch of bookish creators. And I know admittedly I'm not maybe as deep into the community aspect as I could be, so maybe that's something I will work on as well, but being able to kind of unite and raise funds for some really important organizations. And I am personally raising funds for either Brave Space Alliance in Chicago or any organization that supports trans Hoosiers, because I grew up in Indiana and it has been heartbreaking watching legislation based in hate go through the opposite of Hoosier hospitality, putting people that I love in harm's way, at risk, and in danger for just living their lives. And it is the opposite of freedom. And I am just heartbroken by it. I really am. I know that states like Indiana on the internet are easy kind of punching bags, but they are full of good people that are living with this legislation. So I don't know, but this week we will be raising up and celebrating trans voices and reading some really great stories in the process. But for now, I am going to jump into this reading and get the ball rolling. So I will see you in some amount of time that will be much quicker for you than for me. So see you on the other side. Okay, it's over a week later. The trans rights readathon is technically over. I went places last week that would have been great for vlogging, but because my mind is not in the vlogging space, I got home and was like, I didn't take any video, which I'm not technically mad about because I enjoyed my time and enjoyed the space. So today we're just going to talk about the books I read for the trans rights readathon, the books I still have on my TBR from the readathon, and books that I have read and loved before. The reason I didn't do a TBR video before the readathon was kind of because I was expecting this exact scenario, in that I had a TBR of like, what, 8 or 9 books, 3 graphic novels, and 3 audiobooks, and I read 3 books. Now, to be fair, I wasn't feeling great for most of last week. If you watch like my Shadow and Bone season 2 review, you know that I've been dealing with some like ear stuff, which I still think is partly the sound design of that season, but it became a lot more evident that some of it was like sinus pressure stuff. So I was feeling kind of under the weather and wasn't reading as quickly as I hoped, because I really went into the week with a lot of energy and excited and really hoped to read about a book a day because I have been capable of that in the past, and that is a very realistic pace for me. However, it seems like that is not a realistic pace for me and my brain right now, and coming to terms with the fact that that is okay. And that is also why I didn't really set any fundraising goals around how many books I was reading, because I didn't want it to be pressured in that way. I definitely still want you to donate if you feel compelled. The fundraising portion of the event is kind of over in the sense that all of the tallies are being counted up. I believe at last reporting over $160,000 has been raised for various trans organizations over the course of the readathon. So definitely I will still have links below to various charities, especially because during the course of the readathon, some anti-trans legislation that was up in Indiana has been passed through the legislative body. I do not know where in the process that bill is in terms of being passed to the governor's desk. So if you were in Indiana, I honestly want to take this opportunity to beg of you to contact Governor Holcomb's office and contest this bill. This is specifically House Bill 1608, which is the anti-trans legislation. We will be talking about some additional problematic legislation regarding books in Indiana in the next few weeks. Don't worry, but please keep your eye on that as well. So I beg of you, friends, family, fellow Hoosiers, whoever may be watching that has voting power in Indiana, please contact your representatives. Please stand for those that this is going to hurt, stand up for Hoosier hospitality, and really fight for the state and all of those in it, because this is not going to help people stay. And honestly, that may be part of the point. But I'm gonna get off of my soapbox. I urge you to do what you can, especially as I recognize that not everyone is in the position to donate. I donated what I could, but most of you know that I am in a kind of precarious economic situation myself right now. So please, please know that I truly appreciate anyone who was in the position where they could give. And if you weren't, please know that there is no judgment there either. And I appreciate you being around and engaging in this conversation, reading stories, what have you. So the books that I did read, by the nature of the fact that I only finished 3, I have talked about 2/3 of them already in the Feature Friday that I did on Friday for The Wicked Bargain, and in the conversation I had with my friend Katie from the Totally Trans podcast around Detransition Baby. So if you are interested in further discussions of either of those 2 titles, or discussions of those 2 titles from a different angle, I definitely encourage you to check that out. Additionally, Katie did talk about how Totally Trans, the podcast, has a whole episode related to Detransition Baby, so very much urge you to check that out as well. And as she mentioned in that conversation, her podcast is starting a book club. I believe the first pick is Nevada, so please, please check that out if you are interested as well, because we obviously want to keep up the momentum of supporting trans storytelling. So just as a brief, kind of refresher, especially if you weren't able to join me for those other videos, though you should definitely go check them out, I read The Wicked Bargain by Gabe Cold-Novoa. This had been on my list to read because I had seen the author tweet about it a couple months ago, around the time it came out, and I added it to my library hold list. However, it was available, so by the nature of it being available, it kind of kept moving down because I was putting things on hold, and then I needed to read the things that had come in from holds, and this was available, so I knew I could get to it when I wanted to, and I knew inevitably it would just keep shuffling down if I didn't prioritize it. So when this readathon came up, I was like, perfect, I'm going to prioritize this. I will say, I knew this was a pirate book, but looking at the cover, granted, I'd only seen like the little thumbnail of it online or on the library site, I thought this is like a sash kind of blowing in the wind. I definitely thought it might be octopus tentacles. You know what? I don't know where my brain was going with it. It wasn't gonna be like a mermaid situation, but I have seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. I'm a millennial, so like it wasn't completely outside the realm of the possible in my mind. But it's just a sash, no octopus. However, there are of course still pirates, there are still deals with the devil, there is still magic. I really loved this book. As I talked about in my Feature Friday, it was kind of an in-between for me tonally that kind of helped bridge like middle grade or very young YA to an older YA audience, because as we've kind of been having discussions around YA for a while now, there's always discourse, right? This idea that YA has been kind of aging up, whether we should bring back new adult in a really substantial way, or whether new adult has actually come back in a really substantial way, whether young adult is serving teen audiences at this point, and whether it's leaving out this kind of bridge between middle grade and later teens in terms of its readership. All of that is much more involved discussion for sure, but this definitely made me think of it because while a lot of the ideas of the novel are a little older, I mean, you've got pirates, you're talking about death and murder in some cases, you're talking about grief and loss because the book starts out with Mar, our protagonist, losing their entire crew. And yes, their being named Mar after the sea was very intentional and was a great precursor to how well Spanish was going to be woven into this book, it felt so fluid and natural and beautiful within the narrative. So it definitely had some of these harder themes, but it was also kind of balancing this out with a tone that felt a little younger. Not that it, again, wasn't dealing with weighty things or that it was immature, just that it felt like it was accessible to younger audiences as well as older audiences, and the fact that you had a protagonist that was discovering their power and learning how to come into their power, to stop running from their power in a lot of ways, and the fact that their power wasn't only good for destruction. So there were a lot of themes that kind of fit within that bridge for me as well. Now, like I said Friday, I don't have any degrees in childhood literature. I don't have any expertise as a children's librarian or a teacher. I am simply a former nerd and a one-time substitute teacher. So take all of that with a grain of salt. But I definitely feel like it fits within an important space, and we always need more pirate books. So I was especially excited to see especially the audiobook of this, because if I am remembering correctly, one of the actors for Our Flag Means Death reads the audiobook. And again, as I mentioned Friday, I'm like the one person on this planet that hasn't seen Our Flag Means Death. I am so sorry. I know I would love it. All of my friends love it. It hasn't happened yet, but if I remember correctly, that was gaining traction on TikTok, and it was raising up the ranks on Libro.fm as well. So very excited to see this continue to gain traction and hope it continues to find new readers, because it was a lot of fun. And again, because I haven't said it enough before, pirates. So this was my first read of the week. I did read part of this at the beach. I went down to Oak Street Beach Monday because the weather was really nice, and I was like, well, I'm reading a boat book, so I could go to the beach, and then I did. And I also ended up reading part of Detransition Baby that day because I was going to talk about it with Katie later in the week. Now, as we know, I didn't finish Detransition Baby before my conversation with Katie, and I felt really bad about it. But the longer I've sat with the book, because I did kind of dole it out, I got distracted after I finished The Wicked Bargain and moved on to a romance, which we will also talk about. But I kind of kept going in and out of Detransition Baby, and I was judging myself for it a little bit, I'm not gonna lie, especially as I felt kind of behind in the readathon. And then I sat back and I was like, Melody, it's not about the numbers. You want to fully appreciate this novel and this narrative, so however long you need to sit with it, you can sit with it. It's not a race. And again, that's part of the reason I didn't attach like value to every book I read in terms of donation, which I saw a lot of people doing really successfully, but I knew that that would be kind of feeding in for me personally to some of my worst instincts, because I would start to feel guiltier about not reading more. And again, I think sitting with this story was very important and was a service as well. And it ended up being kind of a strange coincidence that I read part of it at Oak Street Beach, because then an important conversation in the book ends up happening there. So what a weird coincidence. And I ended up looking up the author. I didn't know much about Tori Peters before reading the book, and to be fair, I don't know much about her now. However, for a book that was technically set in New York, there were enough references to Chicago, both that conversation at Oak Street Beach when Ames and Katrina were on a business meeting, the references to Water Tower, and then a reference to a couple that they know later that moves to Rogers Park and its description of Rogers Park. I was just like, wait a minute, what's the Chicago connection here? And there was a Chicago connection in that she grew up around Chicago. So as I talked about, or as we talked about in my conversation with Katie, and Katie does a kind of great distillation of the plot of Detransition Baby in our conversation, so I'm not going to rehash that necessarily, but it is an exploration of identity and transness and gender through the lens primarily of motherhood, which is the kind of ideological battleground that a lot of this is fought out on. And by this, I predominantly mean TERFs. And it does get into the politics of a lot of it, the personal politics of a lot of it. It references, you know, trans activists on Twitter, the conversations that happen, this kind of positioning of oppression and how we kind of maneuver these conversations and what power one can claim or kind of chip away at in those conversations by how they position things, and how words can be weaponized in that way, because we know the kind of ideological potholes that we don't want to fall into, and kind of being able to stop conversation in some ways. So there are all of these references to that while presenting a very personal, flawed tale. These are characters that are messy. And as I mentioned to Katie in our conversation as well, and Katie and I are friends in real life, as indicated, and we used to be in a book club together, and we used to sell books together. So we are very familiar with talking about books together, and she is very familiar with a lot of my opinions on things. But it's that kind of messiness that I think a lot of books are aiming for. Like when I talk about mashve and it feeling dark, but it feeling almost gratuitous for shock value in a lot of ways, this is getting at a lot of shocking things. Shocking in its kind of bareness and vulnerability. This idea that everything is kind of stripped away and you are telling some of these darkest truths of your inner psyche. When Katie mentioned on Twitter jokingly that she didn't want her cis friends to read this because she didn't want to be perceived too much, I understand that now. Even as none of these characters are, exactly my friends, there are these kernels of truth that, as I described last week, just feel like a raw wound in some ways. And I found the narrative kind of circling back to one of those early ideologies of feminism, of the personal being political, and kind of these really simple truths in a lot of ways. Because we watch these characters try to navigate their own lives and the messiness of those lives and desires and hopes amidst this larger structure, but we only see the structure kind of creep in occasionally. But it offers a very personal window into what that structure means. And in a kind of direct contrast, I'm going to read a portion that is kind of the bluntest, I think, that the narrative gets in terms of ideology, but nonetheless, it feels important, especially within the context of the readathon and how we are framing these discussions. So, as she stands there gaping, anti-transgender bills ferment in various state senates. Even the liberal media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and New York Magazine, have taken to publishing anti-trans screeds penned by conservatives, the editors disingenuously wringing their hands and pleading balance or wait for the science. Radical feminists and Christian fundamentalists have teamed up to insist that trans women are all pedophiles, that such predators can't be trusted around children or in women's spaces. Every year, the list of murdered trans women, most of color, grows longer. Among those cases, the number of victims who are misgendered in their own obituaries is greater than the number of victims whose murderer has been identified. So that's kind of an overarching thesis in some ways, this kind of framework that we're operating within, but we have these very personal realities playing out amongst that, and these kind of crises of identity kind of centralized around the idea of what it means to be a family, what it means to have a child, what it means to want a child, and it was a very complex exploration. So we had these really high-level explorations amidst these very messy characters. No one in this was 100% likable. They all did different unlikable things at different times. They were messy, and that made them feel so real. I could almost identify as much or more with the friends on the outskirts of whoever's circle and how they were kind of watching all of this play out, and how you hear about everything in like little pieces of gossip or from the mouth directly, but you're hearing about it in this kind of wonder of discovery. You see these characters kind of positioning these choices and being like, oh, this is a great choice, but we're seeing them in the kind of honeymoon phase of that choice. And what is the reality of that choice, and when and how will that reality step in? So I guess what I'm saying is there was a lot to explore here, and I'm really glad I took the time to sit with it and to kind of circle back to that personal is political kind of positioning. In an interview with the author at the end of the book, she says this: I see Twitter encouraging a particular type of politics, an attack or defend mindset. Fiction is a space for a different kind of mindset, a slower, more meditative mindset, which may still be political, but in a different mode. When politics are slower and more personal, and there is less need for rapidly deployable defenses, I sink into my own way of seeing the world. And I think that that is an important framework to consider and an important way or framework through which to read the book. So I found all of that super fascinating. There's so much to discuss. I mean, I could probably do a whole discussion on the layers to the doTERRA party scene in the book, but we're going to move on to the last book I read and the romance I read for the readathon, Drag Me Up by R.M. Virtues. That's shiny. So I've had this on my Kobo for a hot second. I bought it because it was recommended for fans of Katie Robert and the Dark Olympus series, because this is also a romance series that leans more erotic and twists the Greek gods. And Drag Me Up is a Hades and Persephone retelling with a trans Persephone who is a kind of Cirque du Soleil performer or actress within this show that is brought to Hades Club. He runs a, I keep wanting to say gaming hell because I really am stuck in that historical mindset, but he basically owns a casino and it's a kind of Las Vegas feel to everything, and they end up falling in love, but things are complicated by, of course, Zeus and politics within this city. It was everything I was promised. It was steamy, it was engaging, it was an incredibly impressive debut. I would not have known this was a debut if I wasn't told. I will definitely be continuing the series. I think book 2 is Aphrodite and Hephaestus, and book 3 is Athena and Dionysus in book 1 is so lovable. And I'm additionally intrigued by kind of reimaginings of Aphrodite and Hephaestus, and I feel like we haven't seen those take off in the same way that we've seen some other retellings take off. So I'm very interested to see another angle of that for sure. So I'm just gonna reiterate the fact that if you like the Dark Olympus series from Katie Robert, definitely pick this one up because it will be worth your time. Now, this brings us to the more shameful part of the discussion in what I didn't get to, the first being The Witch King by H.E. Edgman. I have The Fake Keeper, the sequel, as well. Maybe I'll do these, maybe I will read or do like a vlog for like books set in fairy realms or with the fae, something along those lines, because I have had this book on my Kobo for a while as well, have been itching to get to it, but it's that thing where it's just kind of fallen down the list as the TBR grows. I actually had to stop myself a couple of weeks before the readathon even from buying a copy at Women and Children First, a physical copy, so maybe that's my sign that I really do need to prioritize, because clearly I do want to read it. I just am overwhelmed by my TBR, I think. So we'll see when I get to that. I do have some pretty big plans, ambitions, goals for April, who knows, but I also think like fairies in May and as we move into summer, that could be a good space. So I don't know, let me know what you're thinking if you have any opinions whatsoever. So moving on, another book that has been on my TBR, and all of these books have been on my TBR anyway, so it was just kind of shuffling them into a stack for this readathon and then inevitably disappointing myself. But Self-Made Boys by Anna Marie McLemore, I admittedly haven't read all of them. I know I need to swing back for sure to Wild Beauty, but particularly in relation to this readathon or building out your TBR of trans stories, I definitely, When the Moon Was Ours is my favorite. I really should go back and reread it. It is lyrical, it has elements of magical realism, it is really gorgeous in a lot of ways, and it is a celebration of love in a lot of ways as well. So I need to swing back and reread that one, and if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend or encourage you to. But I also need to read Self-Made Boys, which is their trans exploration of The Great Gatsby. And then also, as a surprise to no one, I need to read The Sunbearer Trials by Aiden Thomas, which has been on so many lists for the Trans Rights Readathon, as it should be, because Aiden Thomas is a treasure. I've been looking forward to this one and just haven't swung around back to it yet. Thomas is obviously beloved, especially for his book, Cemetery Boys, which I adore and most people adore, and I adore it enough that I have the cards, the pre-order incentive, I believe, though based on the fact that it was a pre-order incentive, I hadn't read the book at the time, but it lived up to its hype. I adore this book. So if for some reason you haven't read this one yet, definitely get on that. And while you're doing that, I will get on reading this one. He also has Lost in the Neverwood, which I believe he has said doesn't have explicitly trans characters. It was one of his first books that was picked up after the success of Cemetery Boys, but I admittedly haven't read that one yet, more because it is a Peter Pan retelling, and I really have to be in the right mood for either Peter Pan or Alice in Wonderland. Like, there are versions of it that I love, like John Logan's Peter and Alice, but otherwise I really do have to be in the right mood. And then in terms of a book that I already own and have been meaning to read and saw other people adding to their lists for the Trans Rights Readathon, so I just shuffled it over into the stack, She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan, which yes, I bought like 2 Christmases ago in the first Barnes & Noble half-off hardcover sale, but you know what? I have books on my TBR I've owned longer, so what about that? But I need to read it. I've heard good things from my friends who've read it, so I really do need to get that going. And then because I couldn't have just one romance on my TBR, even if that's all I read, You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Akweke Emezi, which this is their first romance to my knowledge, but I, of course, enjoy their other books. I have not read their entire catalog, but of course, Pet is one of my absolute favorites. I somehow don't have a copy of Pet, but I do have the prequel Bitter. And then if you need to sob, you can read The Death of Vivek Oji, but be aware that you're gonna sob, and it's hard at parts. This is emotionally a really heavy narrative, so definitely worth your time, definitely gorgeous as all of their writing is, but just, you know, be aware of what you're getting into. And then for a final rec push, anything by Rivers Solomon. I saw a lot of Rivers Solomon titles circulating for recommendations for the readathon, but you can never recommend them too much. I know a lot of people were reading The Deep because it was a little shorter, but In Kindness of Ghosts and Sorrowland, which were absolutely still being recommended as well, are so incredible and definitely something I recommend. And Sorrowland in particular is a heavier novel, but it explores the kind of transformation of anger in a really interesting way. And because I don't want to talk about this book without reading my favorite line, she was a girl made of aches, and she flung her body at the world in the hopes that something, anything might soothe the tenderness. So all of these narratives soothe the tenderness at least a little bit. And while I am sad I didn't get to all of them, I am so, so grateful for the books that I did get to because they were wonderful and complex and offered explorations and escape. So that's what I read for the readathon. What did you read? What did you love? What have you been excited to add to your TBR throughout this process and are looking forward to getting to yet yourself? Because I know we all have never-ending TBRs. It's not just me. So what are we reading next, friends? Let me know what you're thinking. Thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Comment too, it all helps. But read something good. We have plenty of trans stories to pick from, and yeah, bye.